Judge ridicules black teen in court, stunned to discover he's a brilliant lawyer in disguise. The courtroom buzzed with laughter, the air thick with amusement as if mockery itself had seeped into the very walls. At the center of it all sat Judge Morrison, a tall, imposing figure with storm-gray hair. Leaning back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head, he shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and wry amusement. "This has to be a joke, right?" Judge Morrison scoffed, his voice laced with sarcasm as he peered down at the teenager before him. His eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced over the rim of his glasses. "Tell me, young man," he continued, his tone deliberately slow, "do you even know the difference between a subpoena and a sandwich?" A wave of laughter rippled through the room, bouncing off the walls. The attorneys chuckled behind their hands, exchanging knowing looks. Even the reporters in the back whispered among themselves, their cameras momentarily forgotten. In the corner, the teenager's best friend, a lanky figure, crossed his arms with a smirk, shaking his head as if the situation was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever seen. Yet, the teenager himself remained motionless. His oversized, ill-fitting suit only emphasized how out of place he looked in the formal, intimidating setting of the courtroom. But despite his youthful appearance, his expression remained calm, his sharp eyes radiating a quiet intensity that no one could quite explain. Judge Morrison, still flipping through the case file with an air of bemusement, let out a small, incredulous laugh. "I mean, really," he muttered, shaking his head, "a child pretending to be a lawyer? This is a courtroom, not a school talent show." He waved a dismissive hand, motioning to the room as if the absurdity of the situation spoke for itself. "This is real life. People don't play dress-up here." The laughter in the room swelled, and murmurs filled the air. But the boy didn't flinch. He stood firm, his hands gripping the table's edge, fingers pressing into the wood as if anchoring himself to the moment. His eyes remained locked forward, unwavering, and in that silence, the sheer weight of his composure began to pull the energy from the room. He was waiting for the moment he knew was coming. Judge Morrison, his amusement barely contained, leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the teenager. "Tell you what, kid," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "Since you're so eager to embarrass yourself, why don't you go ahead and make your argument? Let's hear what you've got. Give us all a good laugh before I throw this nonsense out the door." A slow smile spread across the teenager's face, one that carried more confidence than a boy his age should have. He reached for a sheet of paper resting on the table, his fingers steady as he unfolded it. Clearing his throat, he spoke. The shift was immediate. The voice that emerged was calm, measured, and strikingly self-assured. There was no hesitation, no stammering, just an authoritative tone that demanded attention. His words were not those of an inexperienced child grasping at legal jargon. No, the argument he presented was razor-sharp, meticulously structured, and just as compelling as anything a seasoned attorney might deliver. He cited obscure laws, referenced intricate statutes, and invoked past rulings, including cases Judge Morrison himself had presided over. His argument was airtight, his logic unshakable. The laughter that had filled the room moments ago faltered. Then it stopped entirely. The whispers faded, and silence settled over the space like a heavy fog. All eyes were now locked on the boy, not with amusement, but with growing intrigue and disbelief. Even Judge Morrison, his hand frozen mid-motion as he held the case file, leaned forward, his smirk vanishing. A subtle but unmistakable shift occurred in his expression. The attorneys who had chuckled just moments before exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence wavering. The teenager's best friend, who had been grinning, now stood rigid, his brow furrowed, his posture tense. By the time the teenager finished speaking, the entire courtroom had transformed. The light-hearted mockery had evaporated, replaced by an undeniable tension. Judge Morrison blinked, his mouth slightly open, his gaze flickering between the teenager and the case file, as if searching for something, anything, that could explain what he had just witnessed. Swallowing hard, he finally spoke. His voice, once dripping with sarcasm, now held something else. Astonishment, maybe even a trace of uncertainty. Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, brow furrowed in disbelief. The teenager, unfazed by the judge's stunned expression, let his slow smile deepen. His voice, steady and sure, carried the weight of absolute certainty. "My name is Ethan Carter, Your Honor," he said, his words crisp and clear, "and I am the attorney representing my client." Silence. For the first time in his career, Judge Morrison had nothing to say. 2 weeks earlier, Ethan Carter had been just an ordinary 16-year-old, or at least that's what everyone believed. He lived in a small apartment with his older sister, Mia, who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Their parents had died in an accident years ago, leaving them to fend for themselves. But Ethan was different. While other kids played video games or watched movies, he devoured legal textbooks. And he didn't just read them, he understood them. He memorized laws, studied court cases, and debated with real attorneys online. Yet no one knew the extent of his brilliance. Not even Mia. One evening, as Ethan sat waiting for his sister to return from work, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. As Ethan listened, he heard his sister on the phone, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "They're trying to evict us. I don't have the money to fight this. I can't afford a lawyer." Ethan's heart pounded. Evict them? Their home was all they had left. He rushed to Mia. "What happened?" he asked. She quickly wiped her tears and forced a weak smile. "It's nothing, Ethan. Just some legal issues. I'll figure it out." But Ethan wasn't naive. He snatched the eviction notice from her hands and scanned it, his eyes narrowing. "Something's not right," he muttered. Mia sighed. "Ethan, just leave it alone. It's not that simple." He didn't listen. That night, he buried himself in legal research, combing through every law book and case file he could find online. And then he found it. A loophole. A crucial error in the paperwork. The landlord was breaking the law. The next morning, Ethan marched to the courthouse and filed a response to the eviction notice himself. The court clerk gawked at him like he was insane, but he didn't care. A hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks. Ethan had no lawyer. He didn't need one. He was going to represent himself. On the day of the hearing, Mia had no idea what he had done. She assumed their case had been dismissed. But when she arrived at the courthouse, she saw him, standing before the judge, dressed in an oversized suit, legal documents in hand. "Ethan?" she gasped. He turned to her and winked. "Trust me." She didn't know whether to scream or pass out. Then the judge entered. The moment Ethan began speaking, the entire courtroom turned against him. The judge mocked him, the lawyers chuckled, and even the audience snickered. They all thought it was a joke. But then he kept talking, and everything changed. Judge Morrison gripped the edge of his desk, staring at Ethan like he had just seen a ghost. How do you know all this?" the judge demanded. Ethan shrugged. "I study." The judge narrowed his eyes. "No, this isn't normal. No teenager just walks into a courtroom and argues a case like this." "Who taught you?" Ethan smiled. "No one." Judge Morrison's jaw tightened. He glanced at the landlord's attorney, who was now visibly sweating. Mia, still in shock, watched as her little brother, the same kid who once got nervous ordering at a restaurant, was systematically dismantling a professional lawyer's case. The landlord's attorney abruptly stood. "Your Honor, this is absurd. He's a child. He has no legal standing to argue this case." Ethan smoothly interjected. "Actually, under state law, any individual has the right to represent themselves in civil court. There is no age requirement." The attorney's face turned red. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and turned to the lawyer. "Is that true?" The attorney hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he muttered, "Technically, yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge rubbed his forehead. "This is insane," he muttered. Ethan remained unfazed. "Shall I continue?" Judge Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled. Proceed. The landlord's attorney clenched his fists. He had expected an easy victory. Instead, he found himself battling a teenager who somehow knew the law better than most adults. He had to put an end to this. Fast. Slamming his hands on the table, he shouted, "Objection, Your Honor! This entire case is a farce. This boy is a fraud, and I demand he be removed from the courtroom immediately." Ethan's heart pounded. He had anticipated this. Taking a steady breath, he prepared his rebuttal. But before he could speak, Judge Morrison nodded. "I agree." Ethan froze. Mia gasped. The judge's voice was firm. "This is not a circus. This boy has no place in my courtroom. Bailiffs, remove him." Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about losing the case. If they threw him out now, Mia would lose everything. This wasn't over. Not yet. As the bailiffs grabbed his arms, Ethan did something no one expected. Something that changed everything. "Your Honor, if you remove me, you'll be breaking the law," he shouted. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The bailiffs hesitated, their grip on his arms loosening. Every single person in the room turned to stare at the teenager who had just accused a sitting judge of violating the law. Judge Morrison's eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" Ethan took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. He straightened his suit and spoke with unwavering confidence. "Under the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, every individual has the right to defend themselves in court. My client has granted me power of attorney. That gives me legal standing. If you throw me out, Your Honor, you will be violating my client's constitutional rights." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. He turned to the landlord's attorney. "Is this true?" The lawyer fumbled with his papers, desperately searching for a counterargument. But Ethan already knew the truth. Finally, the attorney swallowed hard. "Technically, yes." The tension in the courtroom was like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Judge Morrison let out a long breath and rubbed his temples. He was trapped. If he removed Ethan now, he could be accused of misconduct. If he let him stay, well, that was a whole different problem. Finally, with a sigh, the judge waved his hand. "Release him." The bailiffs let go. Ethan straightened his sleeves like nothing had happened. Mia clutched her chest, barely able to process what she was witnessing. "Ethan," she whispered, "what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He simply turned back to the courtroom, standing taller than ever. Judge Morrison adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "All right, young man," he said slowly. "You've made your point. You have the right to be here. But that doesn't mean you're going to win." A small smirk played on Ethan's lips. "Then let's continue." The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension as Ethan resumed his argument. "The eviction notice served to my client is not only unlawful, it's fraudulent," he declared, pacing the courtroom like a seasoned litigator. "The landlord claims my client failed to pay rent, but the payment records tell a different story." He turned to the judge and slid a thick stack of documents onto the desk. "These are bank statements that prove my client has paid rent on time for the past 6 months," Ethan declared, placing the documents on the judge's desk. Judge Morrison flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Public records. A simple request to the bank." The judge's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of approval passed through his eyes. He turned to the landlord's lawyer. "Is this accurate?" The lawyer fumbled, shuffling through his own papers. "Your Honor, this doesn't necessarily prove." Ethan cut him off. "It proves that the eviction notice was filed under false pretenses." He turned to the audience, his voice firm. "And do you know what that's called, ladies and gentlemen?" He slammed his palm against the table. "Fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The landlord's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. That's a serious allegation." Ethan remained unfazed. "You're absolutely right, it is, and that's why I have more evidence." He slid another stack of papers onto the judge's desk. "The landlord has been pulling this scam for months, illegally evicting tenants and then re-renting their units at a higher price. He's made thousands off fraudulent evictions. I have signed statements from previous tenants who were also forced out under similar circumstances. Judge Morrison's expression darkened as he skimmed the documents. His jaw clenched. In the back of the courtroom, the landlord visibly paled. His lawyer, now sweating, tugged at his collar. Mia covered her mouth in disbelief. This wasn't just about their eviction anymore. Ethan was unraveling an entire scheme. The judge exhaled heavily and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he muttered, "this just got interesting." The landlord's lawyer was visibly rattled. "Your Honor, this is just a kid throwing around baseless accusations. He has no formal legal training." Judge Morrison held up a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." He turned to Ethan. "You're saying this isn't just about your client, but a pattern of unlawful evictions?" Ethan nodded. "Exactly." The judge's gaze flickered toward the landlord, who was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "If what this boy is saying holds up, we've got a serious legal issue on our hands," the judge stated. Then, looking at the lawyer, he added, "I want a full investigation into these claims." The lawyer's face turned red, but he didn't argue. Judge Morrison returned his attention to Ethan. He studied him for a long moment before saying, "You're an unusual kid." Ethan smirked. "I hear that a lot." The judge let out a quiet chuckle before clearing his throat. "All right, I'm issuing a temporary stay on the eviction while this matter is investigated." Mia gasped. "You mean we're not getting kicked out?" "For now," the judge confirmed with a nod. He looked at Ethan once more. "But this case isn't over. If your accusations prove true, there will be serious repercussions." Ethan nodded in understanding. The judge sighed. "Court is adjourned until further notice." The sound of his gavel striking echoed through the hushed courtroom. Ethan turned to Mia, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "We did it." Mia stared at him, still in shock. "Ethan, what did you just do?" Before he could respond, the landlord's lawyer stormed toward them, his face burning with fury. "This isn't over, kid," he hissed. "You just made a lot of enemies." Ethan met his glare without flinching. "Good," he said. "That means I'm doing something right." The lawyer sneered before stomping off. Mia grabbed Ethan's arm. "Ethan, this is serious. You just exposed an entire operation. What if they come after us?" Ethan inhaled deeply. He had considered that. But before he could answer, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello," a deep voice responded, smooth and deliberate. "That was impressive, Ethan Carter." Ethan stiffened. His grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say I've been watching, and I think we should meet." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Why?" A pause. "Because, kid, you just stepped into something much bigger than you realize." The line went dead. Ethan stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind. Mia tugged at his sleeve. "Ethan? Who was that?" He hesitated. He could hear the concern in her voice. She'd already been through enough. Losing their parents, barely making ends meet, almost being thrown out of their home. Did he really want to involve her in this? He forced a small smile. "Wrong number," he lied. Mia frowned but didn't push further, too overwhelmed by everything that had just unfolded in court. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, "before that lawyer tries something." Ethan nodded. "Good idea." As they stepped out of the courthouse, he felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. His eyes scanned the street, but everything appeared normal. Still, his instincts told him otherwise. They had to be careful. That night, Ethan sat at his laptop, digging through article after article about the landlord, Mr. Grayson. He wasn't just a small-time property owner, he was wealthy. Very wealthy. He owned multiple buildings across the city. And now Ethan had exposed him. His stomach knotted. Was that what the call had been about? A warning? A threat? His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello." This time, the voice was different. It was urgent, panicked. "Ethan Carter?" His heart pounded. "Who is this?" You don't know me, the voice rushed. But you need to listen. Ethan's breath caught. Why? A heavy silence, then, because you're in danger. Ethan shot to his feet. What? Who are you? A shaky exhale on the other end. I used to work for Grayson. The voice on the phone whispered. I helped him file fake eviction notices. I had no idea how deep it really went, until I tried to leave. That's when I realized. A sudden crash rang through the line, followed by dead silence. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Hello? He called out. No response. Then, a faint sound, heavy breathing. A new voice, deeper and icier, spoke. You should stop digging, kid. Click. The line went dead. Ethan stood frozen, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was bad. Really bad. The next morning, Mia was making coffee when Ethan rushed into the kitchen, still in his pajamas, his face pale. We need to leave, he blurted out. Mia raised an eyebrow. Good morning to you too. I'm serious, he said, pacing. Something's wrong. I got a call last night from someone who used to work for Grayson. They were trying to warn me. He hesitated. Something happened to them. Mia set her coffee down, suddenly alert. What do you mean, something happened? I don't know. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration in his voice. The call got cut off. Then someone else picked up, and they told me to stop digging. Mia's face went pale. Ethan, she whispered. You need to stop. His fists clenched. I can't. This isn't just about us anymore. Mia grabbed his arms, forcing him to face her. Do you hear yourself? These people aren't playing games. If they see you as a threat, they'll... A knock at the door. They both froze. Ethan's stomach twisted. Slowly, Mia crept to the peephole. She gasped. It's the police. Ethan's heart pounded. Had Grayson already made his move? Mia swallowed hard. What do we do? Ethan took a deep breath. Running wasn't an option. Avoiding the cops would only make him look guilty. He squared his shoulders. We open it. Mia bit her lip, hesitated, then slowly turned the handle. The door swung open. 2 officers stood there, their expressions serious. The taller one, Officer Ramirez, pulled out a notepad. Ethan Carter? Ethan forced himself to stand tall. Yes. You need to come with us. Mia gasped. What? Why? Ramirez's face remained unreadable. You're under investigation for fraud. Ethan's stomach dropped. Fraud? He echoed. Before he could say another word, the second officer stepped forward and snapped cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. The world tilted. Mia screamed. No, you can't do this. The officers ignored her. Ethan barely heard her voice as they dragged him away. His mind was racing. How had this happened? Then it hit him. Grayson. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was war. Ethan sat in the back of the police car, wrists bound, heart pounding. This was bad. Worse than he ever imagined. He had walked into court like a genius, turning the case upside down. But now he was the one in trouble. Outside, Mia banged on the car window. You can't do this. He's just a kid. Officer Ramirez sighed but didn't look back. Ma'am, step away. Mia's eyes were wild with panic. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. He turned to Ramirez. What exactly am I being charged with? Ramirez glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Fraud, unauthorized legal representation, obstruction of justice. Ethan's stomach twisted. Obstruction. They were trying to bury him. Who filed the charges? He asked, though he already knew. Ramirez sighed again. You know who? Grayson. Ethan's fists clenched. Mia was still yelling as the car pulled away. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his mind working at full speed. I have to get out of this. 15 minutes later, Ethan was led through the police station, his cuffs digging into his wrists. Whispers followed him as he walked. Isn't that the kid lawyer? I saw him on the news yesterday. Why is he in cuffs? Ethan kept his head high. He wouldn't let them see fear. They guided him into an interrogation room, cold metal chairs, a one-way mirror. Classic setup. He was seated and uncuffed. Moments later, Officer Ramirez walked in, followed by a man in a suit. The man sat across from Ethan and folded his hands. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Cole," he said. "Do you know why you're here?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Because someone wants me to shut up." Cole raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement." "It's a true statement," Ethan shot back. "These charges are fake." Cole leaned forward. "You're 16. No law degree, no license. Yet you walked into a courtroom and argued a case." Ethan held his gaze. "Self-representation is legal. Not when you're representing someone else," Cole countered. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Mia gave me power of attorney." Cole smirked. "That may be true, but you're missing the bigger picture. You embarrassed some very powerful people." There it was. "Mr. Grayson," Cole continued, "filed an official complaint. Claims you falsified evidence." Ethan's blood ran cold. "That's a lie." Cole shrugged. "Then prove it." Ethan's mind raced. "Where's my sister?" he asked. "She's outside trying to find a lawyer. But let's be honest, who's going to take a case for a kid accused of fraud?" Ethan didn't answer. Cole leaned back. "You have no idea how deep this goes. You've made enemies, Ethan. Big ones." Silence. A door opened. Mia stepped in. Her face was pale, shaken, but her eyes burned with determination. "Is he okay?" she demanded. Cole nodded. "For now." Mia turned to Ethan. "We need to get out of here." Ethan didn't take his eyes off Cole. "I'm not backing down." Cole studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You don't have a choice." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Watch me." Later, in a quiet moment, Mia sighed. "You really don't sleep, do you?" Ethan smirked. "No time for jokes." His expression hardened. "I'm in serious trouble." A pause. Then, "What's going on?" Mia asked. Ethan exhaled. "The forged documents, the threats, the broken window, and the guy on the phone." Mia shuddered. "Sounds like you kicked the wrong hornet's nest." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Yeah, and now I need to make sure I don't get stomped." Silence filled the space. This was far from over. "Then I'm in. What do you need?" Ethan exhaled in relief. "I need backup by 7 a.m. Ethan and Mia were waiting outside a diner, sipping bad coffee. Mia was still shaken but stayed close to Ethan, protective as ever. Then a car pulled up. A tall, lean figure stepped out, stretching. His messy blonde hair and oversized hoodie made him look more like a college dropout than anything else. Mia squinted. "Who's this?" The guy smirked and extended a hand. "Leo Parker, the best hacker in this city." Mia blinked. "A hacker?" Ethan nodded. "Leo's a genius when it comes to digging up dirt, and right now we need all the dirt on Grayson we can get." Leo grinned. "So, you want me to take down a millionaire landlord?" He cracked his knuckles. "Sounds fun." Mia looked alarmed. "Ethan, this sounds illegal." Leo chuckled. "Only if we get caught." Ethan shot him a glare. "Not helping." Mia rubbed her temples. "I can't believe this is happening." Ethan ignored her and turned to Leo. "Can you get into Grayson's records?" Leo smirked. "Already did." Ethan's eyes widened. "What?" Leo pulled out his phone. "Last night, after you called, I figured I'd start early. And guess what?" He flipped the phone around. Ethan and Mia leaned in. The screen displayed a series of financial transactions. Lots of them. Leo grinned. "Grayson's been making illegal side deals with city officials, paying people off to look the other way while he evicts tenants and jacks up rent prices." Mia gasped. "Are you serious?" Ethan's blood burned with fury. "That means we've got more than just forgery. We've got corruption." Leo nodded. "And if we drop this in court, Grayson won't just lose, he'll go to prison." Ethan clenched his fists. "Perfect." Mia, however, looked pale. "Ethan, this is huge. If Grayson realizes we have this..." Ethan exhaled. "He already knows." They all fell silent, the weight of the situation settling in. Leo tapped his chin. "All right then, we need a plan." Ethan's mind raced. We go to court, press everything. But we need to be careful. Leo crossed his arms. How careful? Ethan looked him dead in the eye. Careful enough to make it there alive. By 9 a.m., they were in a cab heading toward the courthouse. Ethan's hands were sweaty, but he forced himself to stay calm. Then, a black car appeared in the rearview mirror. It was following them. Mia noticed it too. Ethan, he turned to the driver. Take a different route. The driver frowned but obeyed, turning onto a side street. The black car followed. Mia se breticht. They're following us. Leo swore under his breath. That's not good. Ethan's pulse quickened. They had to lose them. Driver, he said quickly. Get us to the courthouse fast. The driver nodded and slammed on the gas. The black car sped up, tailing them closely. Ethan's stomach twisted. Whoever was in that car didn't want him to make it to court. They were willing to stop him by any means necessary. The cab swerved through traffic, tires screeching on the pavement. Ethan gripped the seat in front of him, his heart pounding like a drum. Mia gasped and turned to look out the back window. They're getting closer. Leo clenched his jaw. We need to lose them now. Ethan turned to the driver. Take the next alley. The driver hesitated. Kid, that's not. Just do it. The driver cursed under his breath but obeyed, yanking the wheel to the right. The cab skidded into a narrow alleyway, barely squeezing between two old buildings. Trash cans toppled over, and a stray cat yowled in surprise. The black car tried to follow but was too big. It slammed into the walls of the alley with a loud crash. Ethan exhaled in relief. That bought us some time. Mia clutched his arm. Ethan, this is crazy. Who are these people? Leo pulled out his phone, typing furiously. Give me a sec. I'm running the plate number. The driver, still shaking, sped out of the alley and back onto the main road. You kids are going to get me killed. Ethan ignored him. He was too focused on the fact that someone had just tried to stop them from reaching court. The courthouse was only a few minutes away now. He wasn't going to let Grayson win, not now, not ever. By the time they reached the courthouse, Ethan's hands were still shaking. Leo checked his phone. Bad news, guys. Ethan took a deep breath. What now? Leo held up his phone. The black car was registered under a shell company. But guess who owns that company? Ethan already knew. Grayson. Leo nodded. He sent those guys to scare you. Mia looked furious. He tried to kill my brother. Leo smirked. Yeah, well, he failed. Ethan clenched his fists. It doesn't matter. We go in there and take him down right now. Mia swallowed hard. Be careful, okay? Ethan gave her a reassuring nod, then turned and pushed through the courthouse doors. Game on. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, attorneys, and city officials filled the seats. Everyone wanted to see the kid lawyer who had taken on a millionaire landlord. Ethan adjusted his tie and walked to his seat. Across the room, Grayson sat with his high-powered lawyers. The man smirked at Ethan, like he had already won. Ethan met his gaze. Not today. Judge Morrison entered, and everyone stood. The moment he sat down, he glanced at Ethan. You again. Ethan smirked. Me again. The judge sighed. All right, let's get this over with. Mr. Carter, you've been accused of fraud and unauthorized legal practice. How do you plead? Ethan stood tall. Not guilty, Your Honor. Grayson's lawyer smirked. We're prepared to prove otherwise. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression calm. Then let's begin, the judge said. Grayson's lawyer went first, painting Ethan as a reckless teenager who had faked evidence to win the eviction case. They called in a handwriting expert, one paid off by Grayson, to claim that Ethan's proof of forgery was inconclusive. Ethan gritted his teeth. He had expected this. When it was his turn, he stood and walked to the evidence table. Your Honor, he began, this case is based on lies. Grayson isn't just trying to evict innocent tenants. He's committing fraud, and I can prove it. Ethan turned to Leo, who was sitting in the back. Leo nodded and sent a file to the court clerk. A few seconds later, The clerk printed out the documents and handed them to the judge. Judge Morrison adjusted his glasses. "What am I looking at?" Ethan's voice was steady. "Bank records showing that Mr. Grayson has been bribing city officials to approve illegal evictions." A gasp rippled through the room. Grayson's face darkened. Ethan continued, "Not only that, but I also have proof that the eviction notices Grayson filed had forged signatures." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Forged?" Ethan walked over to the projector screen and displayed the two documents. "Look at the signatures, Your Honor." The judge leaned in, comparing them. After a long pause, he frowned. "They don't match." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. Someone faked them, and we both know who." All eyes turned to Grayson. The man's jaw clenched. Grayson's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. This evidence was obtained illegally." Judge Morrison raised a hand. "Overruled." The lawyer swallowed hard. Judge Morrison turned to Ethan. "Are you saying that Mr. Grayson knowingly submitted forged legal documents?" Ethan met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. And that's not all." He turned to Leo, who held up his phone. Leo pressed a button, and an audio recording played. A voice echoed through the courtroom. "Drop the case or else." Gasps filled the air. Ethan's heart pounded as he stared straight at Grayson. "That was sent to me last night," he said. "A threat because Mr. Grayson knows he's guilty." Grayson's face twisted with rage. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Grayson, do you deny these allegations?" Grayson shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. He's just a kid. He's lying." Ethan cut in. "Then explain the bank transfers." Grayson's mouth snapped shut. He was trapped. Judge Morrison leaned back, deep in thought. The courtroom was dead silent. Finally, he spoke. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that the charges against Ethan Carter are false." A wave of relief crashed over Ethan, but the judge wasn't finished. "As for Mr. Grayson," he turned to the bailiff, "detain him immediately. We have more than enough to launch a full criminal investigation." Grayson's eyes widened. "Wait, no, you can't." Before he could say another word, two officers grabbed his arms and cuffed him. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Mia let out a choked sob, covering her mouth. Leo fist-pumped. "Oh, that was beautiful." Ethan just smiled. He had done it. He had won. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Ethan, shoving microphones in his face. "Ethan Carter, how does it feel to beat a millionaire landlord in court? Do you plan to become a real lawyer? Were you scared?" Ethan exhaled and looked at Mia, who nodded encouragingly. He turned back to the reporters and grinned. "Scared? Yeah, but sometimes you have to be scared to do what's right." The cameras flashed. Ethan Carter, teenage genius, and now a legend. But as he stood there basking in victory, his phone buzzed with a blocked number. He hesitated before answering. A deep, unfamiliar voice spoke. "You're impressive, Ethan Carter." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say Grayson was only the beginning." Click. The line went dead. Ethan's smile faded. Something told him this fight was far from over. Ethan stood frozen, gripping his phone. His heartbeat, which had finally started to settle after the courtroom victory, spiked again. Grayson was only the beginning. Who was this and what did they mean? Mia tugged his sleeve. "Ethan, what's wrong?" He hesitated for a split second, considering lying, telling her it was nothing. But after everything they'd been through, he knew better. He showed her the phone screen. Blocked number. Mia frowned. "Who was it?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know, but they knew about Grayson." Leo, standing nearby, perked up. Wait. Another mystery villain? Man, this just keeps getting better." Ethan shot him a look. "Leo, this isn't a joke. Someone's watching us." Leo's smirk faded. "Okay, yeah, that's creepy." Mia clutched Ethan's arm. "You're done with this, right? Grayson's gone. We can move on." Ethan wanted to agree. He wanted to tell her this was over, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Not even close. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. The battle, the threats, the car chase, the call. Grayson was only the beginning. What did that mean? He sat up, grabbing his laptop. If someone was trying to warn or threaten him, he needed to be ready. He started digging. At first, he looked into Grayson's business ties. If Grayson had been bribing officials, maybe he wasn't working alone. An hour passed, then two. Then he found it. A name, Robert Calloway. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Calloway was a billionaire real estate mogul. He owned multiple companies, including the one Grayson worked under. Ethan's pulse quickened. Grayson was small-time. Calloway was the king. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Oh man, Leo's going to love this. The next morning, Ethan, Mia, and Leo met at a small cafe. Ethan slid his laptop across the table. Found something. Leo raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Mia sighed. Of course it was. Leo skimmed the screen and then let out a low whistle. Robert Calloway? Dude's a big deal. Ethan nodded. And he's connected to Grayson. I think Grayson was just a small part of something bigger. Mia crossed her arms. Ethan, do you hear yourself? We won. You don't have to keep digging. Ethan met her gaze. Ido. If they're coming after us. Mia flinched. Leo tapped the laptop. All right, say you're right. What's our next move? Ethan exhaled. We find out why Calloway cares about this case. Leo grinned. Now that sounds fun. Mia groaned. I hate this. Ethan squeezed her hand. I know, but we don't have a choice. Mia sighed. Fine. But if someone throws another brick through our window, I'm dragging you out of this. Ethan smirked. Deal. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Leo set up in Leo's apartment. Better security. Fewer prying eyes. Leo cracked his knuckles. Time to break into some billion-dollar secrets. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Legally, Leo grinned. Buddy, do you really want to ask that question? Ethan sighed. Just don't get caught. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard. No promises. Minutes passed. Then bingo. Ethan leaned in. What did you find? Leo pointed to the screen. Calloway owns a lot of properties. But look at these. Ethan scanned the list, his eyes widening. These are all the buildings Grayson evicted tenants from. Leo nodded. And get this, after kicking people out, he bought the buildings at a dirt cheap price. It's a scam. Ethan clenched his jaw. Grayson was forcing people out so Calloway could swoop in and take over. Leo leaned back. Now that Grayson's been exposed, Calloway's trying to make sure you don't dig any deeper. Ethan exhaled sharply. Grayson was just the beginning. Calloway's the real threat, and I've just put myself directly in his crosshairs. That night, as Ethan walked home, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello. A slow, deliberate voice spoke. You should have stopped. Ethan's stomach twisted. The voice chuckled. You're playing a dangerous game. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. And who exactly am I playing against? A pause. Then, I think you already know. Click. The call ended. Ethan swallowed hard, his breath shaky. Calloway. The man knew his name, knew what he was doing, and now he was coming for him. Ethan lowered his phone slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His pulse pounded in his ears. Calloway knew he wasn't just some distant billionaire sitting in a penthouse, unaware of Ethan's existence. He was watching, and he had just made his move. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to think. Panicking wouldn't help. Calloway was powerful, but he was just a man, and men made mistakes. Ethan just had to find one. He turned on his heel and hurried home. The game wasn't over, not yet. Mia nearly tackled him when he walked through the door. Where have you been? She demanded. I've been calling you for an hour. Ethan gently pried her hands off him. I was with Leo. Mia's eyes darted to his phone. And who just called you? Ethan hesitated. Mia's face darkened. Ethan, he sighed, rubbing his temples. It was Calloway. Mia se bretiched. What? He knows I'm looking into him? Ethan nodded, his voice tight. He's trying to scare me off. Mia stepped back, shaking her head. Ethan, this is exactly what I was afraid of. We shouldn't be involved in this. Ethan met her gaze. Mia, if we back off now, we lose. Mia threw her hands up. Lose what, Ethan? We're not cops. We're not FBI agents. We're just two people trying to survive. We should be celebrating that we won against Grayson. Not. Ethan cut her off. And what happens when Calloway sends another Grayson? Or worse, you think he's just going to forget about us? Mia bit her lip. Ethan softened. Mia, I can't let him get away with this. Not after what he did to those people. Not after what he tried to do to us. Mia exhaled slowly, rubbing her arms. She looked at him, really looked at him. Finally, she said, Fine, but promise me one thing. Ethan tilted his head. What? If it gets too dangerous, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We walk away. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. I promise. Mia didn't look convinced. Neither did Ethan. The next day, Ethan and Leo met in an underground parking lot. The only place Leo felt was off the grid enough for their new plan. Leo leaned against a pillar, arms crossed. All right, genius, what's the move? Ethan pulled out his laptop and opened the files they had gathered. Legally, as he liked to put it. Calloway's been buying up properties after evictions, right? Leo nodded. Yeah. Ethan tapped the screen. Look at these transactions. They don't make sense. Leo leaned in. Ah, yeah. Some of these properties were sold to Calloway's company for almost nothing. Like pennies. Ethan smirked. Because the sales were fake. Leo's eyes widened. Wait, are you saying Calloway isn't actually buying these buildings? Ethan explained. He's stealing them. He's forcing evictions, bribing officials, then transferring the property under shell companies so no one can track it back to him. Leo let out a low whistle. Dude's playing Monopoly with real buildings. Ethan nodded. And if we prove this in court, he won't just lose his empire, he'll go to prison. Leo grinned. So what's the plan? Ethan closed the laptop. We need to get into Calloway's private records. Leo's smirk faded. Wait, what? You said you could hack into Grayson's stuff. Can you do the same with Calloway? Leo blinked. Ethan, Calloway is a billionaire. His security is probably tighter than the Pentagon. Ethan folded his arms. But can you do it? Leo hesitated. Then slowly his lips curled into a smirk. Oh, I love a challenge. Ethan grinned. Now we're getting somewhere. By nightfall, Leo was deep into his laptop, typing furiously. Ethan watched over his shoulder, sipping a soda. Anything? Leo exhaled. This guy is paranoid. His files are locked behind so many firewalls. It's ridiculous. Ethan frowned. Can you get through? Leo scoffed. Can I? Of course. But it'll take time. Mia, sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, sighed. This is insane. Ethan shot her a look. You didn't have to stay. Mia narrowed her eyes. Oh, please. Like I was going to leave you two idiots alone with this. Leo smirked. Hey, I take offense to that. Ethan chuckled. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number again. His stomach twisted. He answered. What do you want? A familiar voice responded. You should have listened, Ethan. Ethan's grip tightened. You don't scare me. Calloway chuckled. Oh, kid, that's the problem. You should be scared. A pause. I hope your sister likes surprises. Ethan's blood ran cold. Click. The line went dead. Ethan shot up from his chair. Mia, we need to go now. Mia frowned. What's wrong? Ethan's hands were shaking. Calloway, he just threatened you. Mia's face turned pale. What? Before Ethan could answer, the power in the apartment cut out, plunging them into total darkness. Mia gasped. Ethan. Then, a loud bang on the front door. Ethan's heart stopped. Leo stood in the doorway, eyes wide. Guys, I think we have a problem. Another bang. Ethan swallowed hard. This wasn't a warning anymore. Calloway had sent someone, and they were already here. The apartment was completely dark. The only sounds were Mia's shaky breathing, Leo's muttered curses, and a heavy bang against the door. Then another and another. Whoever was outside wasn't knocking, they were trying to break in. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her away from the living room. "We need to move now." Leo was already shoving his laptop into his backpack when another bang hit. The door cracked, splintering at the hinges. Mia's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. "Ethan!" The lock snapped. The door slammed open. A shadowy figure stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in all black and holding a gun. Mia choked on a scream. Leo swore under his breath. Ethan's stomach twisted. Calloway really sent a guy with a gun. The figure took a step forward. The dim glow of the streetlights outside revealed his face. A hard, scarred jaw, cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't here to talk. Ethan grabbed the closest thing he could, a lamp, and hurled it. Crashed. The man barely flinched. Instead, he raised the gun. "Move!" he ordered, his voice like gravel. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Mia was shaking. Leo's hands curled into fists. But Ethan forced himself to breathe, to think. Calloway wanted him scared, wanted him weak. No, not happening. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to get them out now. His eyes darted to the window. It was risky, but it was their only shot. He tightened his grip on Mia's hand. "On my count." Mia's eyes widened. "Ethan." 1. Leo's muscles tensed. "Oh, hell no." 2. The gunman took another step forward. 3. "Run." Ethan yanked Mia toward the window and leapt. Glass exploded around them as they crashed through. The freezing night air hit Ethan like a punch. For a split second, they were weightless. Then gravity took hold. Ethan hit the ground, rolling. He grunted, pain flaring in his shoulder. Mia landed beside him, gasping for air. Leo followed, stumbling to his feet. "Get up!" Ethan growled, already pulling Mia to her feet. They needed to get out of sight. Gunshots echoed behind them. They didn't have much time. Ethan's legs burned as they sprinted down the street, Leo close behind. They needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere Calloway's people couldn't reach. But for now, all they had was each other, and they were going to keep running. It wouldn't be enough, but it was all they had. He pointed toward a large stack of boxes balanced precariously near the catwalk. Leo's eyes widened. "Oh, you are crazy." Ethan nodded. Leo grinned. "I love it." Mia, however, looked horrified. "I hate it." Ethan whispered, "On my mark." The footsteps below grew closer. The gunman stepped into view, scanning the warehouse with sharp eyes. Then his gaze snapped up. He saw them. His gun rose. Leo kicked the closest crate. The entire stack collapsed. Boxes, metal pipes, and debris rained down. The gunman barely had time to react before the crash. The avalanche slammed into him, knocking him flat. His gun clattered across the floor. Ethan grabbed Mia's hand. "Run!" They bolted down the catwalk, darting toward the emergency exit. They burst into the cold night air, lungs burning. Behind them, the warehouse door flew open. More men, more guns. Mia gasped. "We're not going to make it." Then honk. A beat-up car skidded into the alley. The window rolled down. "Get in!" Ethan's heart jumped. It was the last person he expected, Officer Ramirez. They barely made it inside before the car peeled out. Bullets ripped through the air, shattering the back window. Mia screamed. Leo cursed. Ethan ducked, his heart racing. Ramirez gripped the wheel, eyes locked on the road. "You kids really know how to make enemies," Ramirez said. Ethan panted. "How did you find us?" Ramirez didn't look away from the road. "I've been watching you, Carter." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Why?" Ramirez turned his face serious. "Because you're messing with people who don't lose." Ethan swallowed hard. Ramirez nodded. "And if you don't stop now..." He looked Ethan dead in the eyes. "You won't live long enough to see what happens next." The car swerved down narrow streets. Tires screeched as Officer Ramirez pushed the accelerator. The sound of the engine was the only thing Ethan could hear over the pounding in his chest. His mind raced. Why was Ramirez helping them? Was he part of this? Ramirez glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were hard, but there was something else in them. Something unsettling. "You kids have no idea what you're up against," he said, his voice low. "Calloway is not a man to mess with, and now he knows you're after him." Ethan's stomach turned. "Then why are you helping us?" Ramirez's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "Because I don't like what he's doing to this city, and I owe someone a favor." Mia shot Ethan a nervous glance. She had been quiet since they'd climbed into the car, but her eyes were wide with fear. "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ramirez didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. After a few moments, he finally spoke. "Someone I can't name, but let's just say I've seen the kind of power Calloway has, and I've seen the wreckage." Ethan's mind was spinning. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't back down. But was Ramirez right? Were they in over their heads? The car made a sharp turn, and they were on a new road, far away from the warehouse. Ramirez seemed to be leading them somewhere, but Ethan had no idea where. He barely knew the city well enough to even guess. Leo broke the silence. "So, we're just trusting this guy now?" Ramirez glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "If I wanted you dead, I'd have dropped you off a mile back." Leo frowned but stayed quiet. Ethan turned to Ramirez. "We need information. Calloway is behind everything, but we need proof, real proof. How can we bring him down?" Ramirez didn't respond immediately. The car continued speeding through the dark streets, its headlights slicing through the night. Finally, Ramirez spoke. "You're not going to be able to take him down with what you have, not yet." Ethan's frustration bubbled up. "Then what do we need?" "We have evidence, Grayson's records, the bank transactions, everything he's been doing." Ramirez shook his head. "Not enough." He let out a deep breath, his gaze steady. "You need to know what's really going on. And to do that, you're going to have to get to Calloway himself." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "How?" Ramirez's grip tightened on the wheel. "He's been hiding in plain sight. His operations are massive. You have to get close, infiltrate his network, get him to trust you." Leo raised an eyebrow. "Trust us? Are you kidding?" Ramirez didn't look at him. "It's your best shot." Ethan's mind was a whirlwind. It seemed impossible. Getting close to someone like Calloway, who was surrounded by an army of guards and corrupt officials. But then he remembered something. Grayson, Calloway's right-hand man, had been involved in this too. He had been in the courtroom when Ethan exposed the fraud. Was that just coincidence? Or was Grayson planning to have Ethan removed? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted as Ramirez took another sharp turn. The car slowed to a stop in front of an unmarked building. They were in a completely different part of the city now, one Ethan didn't recognize. It looked like a storage facility, surrounded by high fences and gates. Ramirez shut off the engine. "Get out," he said, his voice grim. Mia was the first to speak. "Where are we?" Ramirez ignored her question. "You need to be prepared for what you'll find in there. Calloway's people have eyes everywhere. You can't trust anyone." Ethan nodded. "What's inside?" Ramirez took a deep breath. "This is where it all comes together. The shady deals, the falsified records, the money laundering. If you want to get him, you need what's in there." Ethan's heart began to race again. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. This was the key. "Let's go," he said. They got out of the car, and Ramirez led them toward the building. It was dark except for a dim light coming from the side. Ramirez moved like he knew exactly where he was going, stepping lightly and purposefully. Ethan, Leo, and Mia followed, their footsteps echoing in the night. When they reached the back of the building, Ramirez crouched by a small door and pulled a key out of his pocket. He unlocked the door with a soft click. "This is it," he whispered. They stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The only sound was the faint hum of machines in the distance. Ethan's mind was racing. This was their chance. They followed Ramirez through the dark building, past towering shelves filled with unmarked boxes. The further they walked, the more Ethan felt like they were heading into the belly of the beast. Finally, They reached a heavy door at the back of the room. Ramirez stopped and turned to face them. "This is where it gets serious," he warned. "The files you need are in there, but don't expect an easy time getting them. Calloway's people have been watching this place for years." Mia bit her lip. "So how do we get in?" Ramirez reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and the lock on the door clicked open. Ethan's breath caught. "What's that?" "A hacking tool," Ramirez said simply. "It'll give you access to the network, but once you're in, you have to move quickly. Don't waste time." He opened the door and gestured for them to enter. Ethan stepped inside, feeling like the walls were closing in. The room was full of old filing cabinets and security monitors. It was a maze of data, everything Calloway had been working on. Leo moved toward the monitors. "Looks like we're in," he said, pulling up files on the screen. Ethan felt a wave of relief, but then a sound, a footstep. Ethan's heart stopped. Someone was coming. The footstep was faint at first, but it was enough to send a shiver down Ethan's spine. His breath hitched. The walls around him seemed to close in even more. He turned, but the room was still silent, save for the quiet hum of the machines. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. She was looking around, eyes wide with fear. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. "Someone's here." Leo stood at the computer terminal, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. "We need more time. These files are encrypted. I'm almost through, but not yet." Ethan took a deep breath and quickly assessed the situation. They were in a warehouse filled with sensitive files. If someone had heard them, they wouldn't have much time before the guards arrived. They needed to get out and fast. He motioned to Mia and Leo. "Keep working. I'll cover you." "Cover us?" Leo hissed. "Are you out of your mind? You think we're just going to sit here while you play hero?" He sounded frustrated, but Ethan didn't have time for arguments. There was no other option. Ethan glanced toward the door. The footsteps were getting louder now. Someone was definitely coming toward them. His hand instinctively reached into his jacket pocket, where he kept the small knife he carried for emergencies. The tool was a small comfort, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to handle whoever was coming. "Get ready," Ethan muttered under his breath. Leo's face shifted, clearly realizing the situation was growing more dangerous. "Fine. But if we end up fighting our way out of here, I swear I'll never speak to you again." Ethan gave a quick, tight smile. "That's fair." Mia grabbed his arm. "We don't have much time. Do you hear them? They're getting closer." Ethan nodded. He could hear the sound now too, a faint shuffle of feet on concrete. He turned and started moving silently, heading toward the door that led to the back hall of the warehouse. He motioned for Leo to stay at the terminal and for Mia to follow him. As he pressed his back against the cold wall, he exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. The door handle was cold under his grip, and he felt the weight of what was about to happen. They had to get those files, but they also needed to get out alive. "How much longer?" Ethan whispered to Leo, his voice low and tense. Leo didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the screen. "The files are almost ready. Just a couple more minutes, but we might not have that long." "Just do it," Ethan muttered, his mind racing. "We need to make it count." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He quickly glanced back toward the terminal. Leo was still working furiously, typing on the keyboard. Mia stood near him, tense, her eyes darting nervously. Ethan slowly inched toward the door, listening intently. Was someone outside? Then he heard it. A muffled voice, low but unmistakable. "Check the back. They're in there." Ethan's heart sank. The guards were already on their way. They had to move now. With one final look back at the terminal, Ethan grabbed Mia's arm and bolted toward the door, pushing it open just enough to slip through. He could hear Leo mutter a curse behind them as the door clicked shut, but he didn't have time to explain. One of the voices was unmistakable. The sound of another voice, harsh and cold, carried over the wind. "They went this way. Find them." Ethan's stomach lurched. They had to find a way out. Up ahead, He spotted a small set of stairs that led to an old, rusted fire escape. It was high, but it was their only chance. Up! Ethan shouted, pulling Mia and Leo toward the stairs. Mia was struggling to keep up, but she gritted her teeth and followed. Leo was right behind them. They reached the stairs just as the first pursuers turned the corner. Ethan climbed faster, pulling Mia up behind him. He looked down briefly and saw the two men from the warehouse now sprinting toward the stairs. His heart raced. They were closing in. They had no choice but to go up. To reach the rooftops. They made it to the top just as the sound of footsteps and shouts echoed behind them. The door slammed open, but Ethan didn't look back. "We've got to keep going," he said, his voice tight with urgency. They were on the roof now, staring out at the city spread below them. Ethan could see the lights of distant buildings, but they had no plan. They couldn't run forever, but at least for now, they were out of immediate danger. Leo breathed heavily. "Okay, now what?" Ethan glanced around, looking for an escape route. He couldn't think straight. His mind was buzzing with everything that had happened. But one thing was clear. They had to get out of the city. "Get to the other side," Ethan said firmly, gesturing toward a narrow gap between two towering buildings. His voice was steady, though the urgency of their situation hung in the air. "We can make the jump from there. We can find a safer place to regroup." Mia, her face pale and her hands trembling, hesitated for a moment before nodding. Her eyes flickered to the gap, then back to Ethan, the weight of the decision sinking in. Then she asked, her voice tight, edged with both fear and the remnants of disbelief, "Then we fight back?" Ethan replied, his voice unwavering despite the gnawing tension in his chest. "We stop Calloway before he can hurt anyone else. We end this tonight." The night seemed to stretch on forever as they moved across the rooftops, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the city. Their bodies ached from the constant motion, the adrenaline still surging through their veins like a lifeline. But as much as their hearts pounded and their legs burned, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of something looming over them, a shadow that seemed to chase them, even across the open sky. They weren't truly safe yet, not by a long shot. Calloway's reach was vast, his influence insidious. Ethan knew that even if they managed to escape tonight, they couldn't outrun him forever. This was just the beginning of a much darker struggle. The rooftop beneath Ethan's feet was cold, almost painfully so. The chill of the wind cut through the thin fabric of his jacket like a knife. His breath came in ragged bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs as they navigated the narrow ledges between the buildings. His eyes kept darting over his shoulder every few steps, instinctively searching for any sign of pursuit. He half expected to see the bright beams of flashlights cutting through the dark, the telltale sounds of Calloway's men closing in on them. But each time he turned, all he saw was the sprawling city below, a skyline, an impenetrable wall of shadow. The towering buildings stretched up into the night, disappearing into the mist beyond. When they finally reached the next building, Ethan's relief was brief. They had made it, but the escape wasn't over, far from it. His heart was pounding in his chest, not just from the physical exertion of their flight, but from the relentless pressure building in his mind. The questions that gnawed at him, the uncertainty of what came next. What now? The escape had been swift, but it couldn't last. The distance between them and Calloway's men wouldn't be enough. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to turn and face Calloway. But how? What did they have? They had the files, yes, but those were just the surface. To truly bring Calloway down, they needed more. They needed something irrefutable, something that would shake the very foundations of his power and force those who had turned a blind eye to face the truth. But what was it? What could they use? Mia's voice broke through his thoughts, a fragile thread of sound in the oppressive silence. Ethan turned sharply, his gaze finding her standing near the edge of the rooftop. Her hand gripped the cold iron railing, knuckles white. Her face was still ashen, the terror she had felt earlier now settling into the lines of her expression. Her eyes were wide, distant. She was looking out across the city, but Ethan could see her mind was far from the skyline. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the question itself might shatter the fragile moment they were caught in. Are we really going after him? The weight of her words hung in the air between them, thick with the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Ethan's chest tightened. The pressure was building again. There was no turning back now, but was it enough? Could they really stop someone like Calloway with all his resources and power? Ethan's throat constricted, the weight of her words settling like a stone in his chest. He knew exactly what she meant. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. Just a few short weeks ago, they had been nothing more than two siblings scraping by, trying to make ends meet in a world that felt big and cold. Now they were entangled in a web far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. What had started as a simple fight for survival had escalated into something monstrous, a threat that loomed over them like an unstoppable tide. The danger wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was real. It was here. And Ethan wasn't sure how much longer they could keep outrunning it. But there was no turning back, not now. Not when they were so close to finally ending this nightmare. "We don't have a choice," Ethan said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of the tension he felt deep inside. He couldn't afford to sound uncertain, not now. They needed resolve, but the words felt heavier than he wanted them to. "If we stop now, people like Calloway will just keep doing what they've been doing, hurting people, ruining lives, destroying everything in their path. We can't let that happen. We can't let him win." Mia's eyes, usually so full of fire and determination, now seemed distant, focused on something far beyond the present moment. She nodded slowly, but Ethan could see the fear etched into her expression. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words faltered, caught somewhere between her mind and her heart. She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared. What if we don't make it out of this? What if something happens to you? What if?" She trailed off. The fear in her voice was stark and raw. The fear in her voice hit Ethan harder than he expected. It made his chest tighten, a sharp pang of guilt and protectiveness clawing at him. He knew she was terrified. Hell, they all were. But he couldn't give her the comfort she needed, not the way she wanted. The truth was too painful, too uncertain. And yet, he couldn't let her carry this burden alone. He had to reassure her somehow. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said quietly, his words firm but wrapped in a tenderness that came from somewhere deep within. "We'll get through this, Mia, together. No matter what happens, I'll make sure we both make it out of this. You have my word." She met his eyes, searching for the truth in them, but there was no certainty in any of it. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay. He didn't have that kind of control, but they would face this together, and that was all he could give her. Leo, who had been standing quietly at the edge of their conversation, suddenly broke the silence with a loud, exaggerated sigh. He stepped forward, his usual smirk returning, trying to break through the heavy tension that had settled over them all. "Yeah, and if anyone tries to hurt you, they'll have to get through me first," Leo said, his voice laced with humor. But there was an undeniable edge to it. He straightened up, the playful glint in his eye turning serious as he leaned in. "I've got more than a few tricks up my sleeve, and I've got plenty of experience hacking into bad guys' systems. If I can crack into Calloway's database, we'll find the info we need to bring him down once and for all." Despite the gravity of their situation, Ethan couldn't help but smile at Leo's bravado. It was the kind of confidence that they all needed right now, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. "I'm glad you're with us," Ethan said, his voice soft, though there was still a quiet determination in his tone. "Always," Leo replied, his voice shifting to something deeper, more resolute. He stood up a little straighter, the playful smirk giving way to something fiercer. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Calloway gets exactly what's coming to him." "No merci." The sheer conviction in Leo's voice was a lifeline. It gave Ethan the clarity he needed to focus and remember why they were doing this in the first place. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had been hurt, betrayed, and destroyed by people like Calloway. They had to stop him, no matter the cost. If they were going to succeed, it would take all three of them, Mia, Leo, and Ethan. They were a team, and together they were stronger than any of the enemies standing in their way. They just had to outsmart them, outrun them, and push forward with more courage than they had ever known. Ethan's mind shifted, focusing back on their immediate plan. They couldn't afford to stay on the rooftops much longer. It was only a matter of time before Calloway's men found them. The city felt vast, but the walls were closing in. It was time for the next phase of their escape. "All right," Ethan said, clapping his hands together with a determination he hoped would rub off on everyone. "We need to move. There's a safe house we can get to. It's not much, but it'll buy us some time to regroup and figure out our next step." He glanced around the rooftop, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The last thing they needed was to be followed. They had to stay a step ahead. "It's not fancy, but it's safe for now," Ethan continued, his voice low but steady. "Mia and I used to go there when we were younger. It's an old family friend's place. They owe us a favor and they'll keep us hidden. We can stay there while we lay low and figure out what comes next." Leo raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "Right? So where exactly is this safe house, then?" he asked, his usual teasing tone returning, though there was a flicker of genuine interest behind it. Ethan pulled out his phone, swiping over the screen to bring up the map. "It's in the lower part of the city, not far from here, but it's off the beaten path. Trust me, it's a good spot." Leo nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Mia. "All right, lead the way. We'll get there, stay out of sight, and figure out our next move from there." Ethan gave him a tight-lipped smile and nodded, already calculating their route in his mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a while he felt a glimmer of hope. They had a plan and they had each other. That had to be enough for now. Mia let out a soft breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly, but there was still a flicker of unease in her eyes. A shadow crossed her face and she looked up at Ethan with uncertainty. "You really think it's safe there?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt, as though she couldn't fully convince herself that they were out of danger just yet. Ethan met her gaze with steady intensity, his own thoughts racing, but his tone unwavering. "It's our best option right now. It's the safest place we have at the moment. We'll be okay, at least for now," he reassured her, trying to give her the confidence she needed. Even though a part of him wasn't entirely sure either, the stakes were higher than they had ever been, but they couldn't afford to second-guess themselves. Mia gave him a small nod, still not fully convinced, but it was enough for her to trust him for the time being. Leo, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up with a small but determined smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "All right, then," he said, his voice calm but laced with determination. "Let's get moving." The urgency in his words was clear, but so was his focus. They had no time to waste. By the time they reached the safe house, the sky had begun to shift. The deep black of night slowly faded into the softer graying hues of early dawn. The world outside was quiet, still, as if holding its breath. The safe house itself was nothing special. An old, run-down apartment building nestled on the edge of town. Its walls had seen better days, and its windows were small, cracked in places. But it offered one critical thing: anonymity hidden in plain sight. And for now, that was enough. They entered through the back, moving quickly but quietly, knowing that the less attention they attracted, the better. The old stairwell creaked under their weight, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, reminding them just how exposed they were, even in this seemingly safe haven. Ethan led the way, pushing open the door with a subtle nudge and ushering Mia and Leo inside. The space was dim, with only a weak light coming through the grimy windows. But there was a warmth to it, a feeling of safety they hadn't experienced in a while. The air smelled faintly of dust and stale furniture, as if the place had been abandoned for years, but it was clean enough. It was a shelter, and for now, that was all that mattered. Leo didn't waste any time. He dropped his bag by the small table in the corner and immediately pulled out his laptop. His fingers moved quickly over the keys as he set up, already getting to work on cracking Calloway's systems. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that came with knowing they were on the precipice of something huge. Ethan couldn't stop moving. His mind was racing, thoughts spinning in a blur, each one darker than the last. He couldn't settle, couldn't focus, not with what was at stake. The weight of their mission was bearing down on him, but they couldn't afford to falter. Not now, not when they were so close to bringing Calloway down. Mia, on the other hand, was still. She had settled on the worn couch in the corner, her legs tucked underneath her, a protective, almost instinctive gesture. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to shut out the world, trying to calm the storm inside her. Ethan could see it in her. She was scared. She was trying to hide it, to put on a brave face for the team, but he knew her well enough to read between the lines. Fear was there, lurking beneath the surface. He felt it too. She broke the silence first. Her voice barely a whisper, a soft question that cut through the quiet tension. How long do you think we have before Calloway sends more people after us? Her eyes were wide, anxious, locked onto Ethan's, searching for reassurance that he wasn't sure he could offer. Ethan glanced at her, his throat tight as he tried to push down the rising sense of dread. I don't know, he admitted, his voice low but steady. But we're going to make sure that doesn't matter. We have everything we need to take him down. We just need to make sure it counts. His words were a promise, even if a part of him was uncertain about how long they could keep up this fight. But they were too far in to back out now. Mia nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes that didn't escape him. Ethan's heart sank, but he tried to keep his own fears in check. They were up against a man with the kind of power and reach that could crush them all with a single call, and yet they had no choice but to keep pushing forward. They had the evidence, the files, the truth, and in the end, the truth would be their weapon. It had to be enough. Just as the weight of their situation began to press down on them again, Leo let out a sharp, triumphant cheer from across the room. Ethan's head whipped around, his pulse spiking. Got it, Leo called out, his voice a mix of relief and exhilaration. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing as he hurried over to see what Leo had uncovered. Got what? He asked, his voice urgent, almost desperate for some good news. Leo turned the laptop toward them, the screen filled with a maze of data that Ethan had no hope of fully understanding at first glance. But the numbers and files on the screen didn't matter. It was the headline that caught Ethan's eye: Calloway's entire financial network. Leo's fingers tapped the keys again, and a flood of information began to spill onto the screen. I'm talking everything: his offshore accounts, the bribes, the fake transactions, the buildings he's been stealing from people. All of it. It's all here. His voice was filled with disbelief and a certain satisfaction. They had it. The smoking gun. Ethan could feel the weight of that truth settle in the room with them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. They were ready. Ethan stepped forward, his heart racing, as his eyes widened in disbelief. Can you get it into the right hands? He asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and urgency. Leo flashed a confident grin, one that barely contained the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. Already done, he replied smoothly. I sent it to a few journalists I trust, people who owe me a favor. By tomorrow, this will be all over the news. The whole world will know the truth. But we need to stay out of sight for now. Keep our heads low. Once it hits the airwaves, Calloway won't be able to deny it, no matter how hard he tries. Ethan's chest tightened as he absorbed Leo's words, a whirlwind of emotions flooding through him. There was a sense of relief. After all this time, the evidence they had painstakingly gathered would finally see the light of day. But there was also an undeniable surge of nervous anticipation. They had done it. They had the smoking gun, and they were about to bring down a powerful, dangerous man. It felt like victory was within reach, like the weight of the world might finally lift. And yet, even with this monumental step, something in the pit of Ethan's stomach told him it wasn't over. The feeling was gnawing, unsettling, almost as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. As Leo leaned over his screen, his fingers flying over the keys as he continued to monitor the network. Ethan's attention drifted. He scanned the room, and an eerie silence settled over them. The quiet was deafening, almost unnatural in its stillness. Ethan glanced out the window, where the first rays of sunlight were spilling across the city, casting long, dramatic shadows in the corners of the room. It was as though the city itself had yet to wake, still caught in the deep quiet of dawn. Outside, everything appeared calm, peaceful even, but Ethan knew better than to be lulled by appearances. The world they had just stepped into was a far cry from the safety of the ordinary day-to-day. Calloway was no mere criminal. He was a force to be reckoned with, ruthless and relentless. This wasn't the end of the fight. In fact, Ethan could feel it in his bones that the worst was yet to come. They weren't just exposing a criminal. They were making a powerful enemy who would stop at nothing to protect himself and his interests. With every fiber of his being, Ethan could sense that Calloway wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. The battle they had just started wasn't going to end with the release of a few news stories. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Despite the victory they just secured, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to get much more complicated. They had their evidence, yes, but they also had a target on their backs, and he knew that staying in the shadows for just a little while wouldn't be enough to guarantee their safety. The moment of triumph was fleeting, quickly replaced by a gnawing, suffocating weight in Ethan's chest. He tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, steady and unrelenting. They had just made a decision that would change everything, and now the real fight was about to begin. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to press the subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means a lot to us and drives us to continue creating content with heart. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed what we shared today, as every interaction helps us grow and allows us to continue connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.